Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, back again for another episode of the award-winning Everything Compliance. Today, we have a quartet of myself, Karen Woody, Karen Moore, and Matt Kelly. We may or may not have Mr. Marks, depending on if he can resolve some tech issues. We are going to fire off. We're going to start with, why don't we start with you, Karen, the second furthest west. And then we'll go Karen Woody, Karen Moore, and Matt Kelly, you'll bat third, and I'll come in for cleanup.
Sure.
What do you have for us today, Karen Woody?
Hi, all. I am going to talk today about the Cognizant trial that should have been for, well, 2 days at least underway if things had gone according to plan. But we know with all things FCPA right now, nothing is according to plan, or at least the plan seems to have been thrown out the window. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what has happened, even just in the last few days regarding this. What should have been was a very highly anticipated, highly watched trial that was going to happen. One of the rare ones for executives related to allegations of FCPA violation. So if the term cognizant or the concept of a cognizant trial sounds familiar, it's because it's come up a number of times. And so this is the trial against two executives of Cognizant, a soft company. um, their names are Gordon Coburn and Stephen Schwartz. They were initially charged in 2019, and even though that is now 6 years ago, their trial was supposed to start this week. So what were they charged with? In February 2019, the DOJ charged these two individuals as well as the company, and I'll speak in a second about what happened with the company. But in February 2019, the DOJ alleged that these two individuals had authorized an unlawful payment of around $2 million that was going to go to one or more foreign officials in India to secure the necessary permits in order to build, sort of break ground on a new office campus for Cognizant. So the way they were going to facilitate this or have this actually take place is that they had agreed to set this up through a third party construction company that was going to obtain these permits by bribing the foreign official, and then Cognizant was going to pay back this third party. So pretty standard. And the way that was all going to move through Cognizant's books was through sort of various invoices regarding delay and sort of keep um, getting the $2 million basically out the door to this third party. Um, so that's the core set of facts here. The DOJ and SEC also brought these charges against Cognizant as the entity as well, but those charges were handled by an enforcement action by the SEC, in which Cognizant neither admitted nor denied the essence of the allegations and agreed to a $25 million payment in disgorgement and prejudgment interest. And correspondingly, the DOJ also issued one of its highly sought after declinations against Cognizant, sort of citing its handling this through the SEC and a number of other reasons. So that was all happening years ago. But these two individuals were set to go to trial. And this trial has been delayed a number of times. So, and like I said, we are now in a new era of the FCPA. So there's even more shakeup in the last month. But basically, the trial is supposed to start Monday on March 3rd. But we know about just about now a month ago, President Trump issued an executive order pausing the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act enforcement. And then I think the full title is to further American economic and national security. Of course, there was a corresponding speech by Attorney General Bondi that was essentially declaring that the FCPA enforcement was not going to be a major priority of the DOJ unless it involves sort of foreign drug cartels, which remains to be seen how that works out. Nevertheless, despite that executive order, the prosecutors on the Cognizant case issued a letter on February 21st that said they intended to proceed to trial this past Monday as scheduled. The trial was delayed to Tuesday and then eventually to Wednesday for unexplained medical reasons, but basically it was going to happen. It was going to really get off the ground on Wednesday. I should note that this is actually the second time that this trial has been sort of put on pause or sort of been handled, and it's been unique in the timing. So this was originally supposed to go to trial in October 2023, but at that point, the prosecutors had asked for an adjournment because of witnesses and trying to get witnesses to travel to New Jersey from India. That ended up being nearly a 17-month delay because of a judge who retired and a number of other sort of uh, issues. So basically, we've been trying to get this trial off the ground for nearly at least 18 months or somewhere in there. But what has happened then this week? So again, letter on February 21st from the prosecutor saying we're moving ahead. We know Trump said this thing that shouldn't affect us. We were on the eve of trial nearly. But then on Monday, March 3rd, John Giordano took the oath of office on Monday night to become the U.S. Attorney in New Jersey. And then that next morning after that, he requested an immediate sort of abrupt reversal of the government's decision to go to trial and instead asked for a 180-day adjournment of the trial. And so that he could consider the application of the executive order and the new DOJ priorities on this in the matter. Okay, that's Wednesday. So we're in there. So then yesterday, Thursday, the judge says, okay, I'm inclined to maybe allow for some amount of delay here, but I'm going to need you to brief how this will affect this when this starts, especially given implications of potential Speedy Trial Act. So the ask is for a 180-day adjournment. And so the in response initially to the judge, although briefings on this are due on Monday, Giordano said the Speedy Trial Act will be told. And interestingly, the defense agreed to that. And so the reasons that both parties asserted that the Speedy Trial Act should be told is that there actually there was, like I said, these medical reasons that the jury selection was pushed at least another couple weeks, or at least 1 week. There also had been another motion in limine to sort of pause it that likely would have stopped the clock through a magistrate judge motions practice. And then they basically said that there is an exception to the Speedy Trial Act when there is these ends of justice that will be served by virtue of tolling the speedy trial. So where does that leave us? We shall see. I think there certainly will be a delay. But I think a natural question is how in the world did the defense agree to this tolling of the Speedy Trial Act? And I think the answer is fairly, I hope, obvious, which is the defense believes, and maybe rightly, that this case likely will just go away. We have, again, over and over, this repeated comment from this current DOJ that the FCPA is not a priority, that maybe this is not something they want to pursue or use resources on. There is some chatter that maybe even the case itself isn't necessarily a slam dunk for the government. I'm sure the government very much disagrees with that characterization, but there's some to be said that this could be considered maybe a facilitation payment that was happening. But before even getting into that, I do think there's just the broader concept, which is this is not something the Trump Justice Department wants to prioritize. Another important caveat of something that happened just yesterday or 2 days ago, likely, is that the government is represented in this case by Glenn Leon, who was the chief of the fraud section until basically 48 hours ago when he was reassigned to the deputy AG's office, who's, as of yesterday, is Todd Blanche. Query what you think the reasons for that are or whatever. There's this sort of an unforeseen reassignment of the chief of the fraud section who was handling this matter. So all that to say, if I was a betting person, I would bet that this is entirely going away, probably sooner rather than later. And these Cognizant execs are beyond lucky that the witnesses weren't available now a year and a half ago, because I think this might all very much all inure to their benefit. So that's what I have on sort of, again, the day to day. Who knows what will happen today, but it's been a fast moving sort of space, despite this being a now 6-year-old case.
We're recording this before noon. Lots could happen. Karen Moore, you have a question or comment, then Matt, you're up next, and I'll follow.
Yeah, I was just thinking about the fact that not only is the current administration sort of moving its focus and resources away from FCPA enforcement, but also this appears to be potentially a signal that they're moving away from kind of prior policy statements that individual accountability was going to become a focus area. So I'm just wondering, do you think, Karen, that's a little bit of a driver? Is it sending a message? What does it mean for compliance officers when they're kind of using that? I've had those conversations, that threat of individual accountability is part of the kind of be all and end all of where our execs need to be focusing on their own careful actions. how does that play into where we're seeing justice going?
Yeah, it's a great point, and I would have maybe initially taken issue that is an entirely change of tack. If anything, I would have said we might swing even further, at least in that lip service of individual accountability and away from corporate responsibility. I do think there'll be a lighter touch on corporations, and maybe the way that becomes palatable is that there is someone offered up, and that's sort of the scapegoat here. I say that might be lip service because I do think there's gonna be a soft touch no matter what, but I don't know if I would characterize it entirely as a lessening of the individual as paramount, because we've seen that at least even from the SEC side. I think Paul Atkins and others even there, I think, again, I think will be much kinder to corporate resolutions and this idea of sort of corporate criminal liability, but still might lay the burn at the feet of certain individuals. And again, that might be unfortunate for some random person who takes the fall, but it's a good point. I do think, I don't know is the answer. I don't know if I would characterize this as like a stepping back from individual accountability as much as it's just a broad step back from FCPA enforcement.
I'm struggling to figure out what is the most cynical interpretation I could put on this chain of events, because that's probably going to be the right one.
Yeah.
Absolutely. This case is never going to happen. I will bet my mortgage payment on that. And rest assured, my mortgage payment is a lot of money. No, we're not going to see this happen. These guys have lucked out, like Karen said. But I just, I can't help but think a couple of things about the Cognizant case. We should always remember once upon a time, the corporate enforcement settlement against Cognizant was held up as the right way to handle these things. And I think it was back then that the board at Cognizant self-disclosed this matter to regulators within weeks of hearing that they had this problem. And back then, which was, I want to say like in 2017 or so, when they first heard about it, they had no idea what might happen to them. And we did not yet have the very generous corporate enforcement policy that we now take for granted, which will now be even like the no corporate enforcement policy when Trump is done with it. But they always and I talked to one or two of the board directors there on the audit committee who made that decision. And they basically said, yeah, this was the right thing to do. And we knew it. And we knew we might get taken to the woodshed, but we were going to do it anyways. And if you ever want to see an example of how good integrity at the board level and at the corporate level looks, go back and look to the original FCPA settlement for Cognizant as a whole, because it really was a good way to handle it. And they got a fairly good resolution for what was a pretty clear cut, in my opinion, abuse of the FCPA. The other question that I've been thinking about a lot this week is what would a enforceable FCPA offense look like in the eyes of Donald Trump? Because if you go back and you read his pause executive order, it talks a lot about corporate deals that serve strategic U.S. interests. What Cognizant did was basically building I think it was a data center or a training center in India. That has nothing to do with serving U.S. interests. So in theory, you should be able to say, yeah, we're going to enforce against that because the law says no corruption, and there was corruption. Trump kind of, sort of, with his order was saying if this was going to be corruption to acquire the ports of the Panama Canal, sure, we'll turn a blind eye to corruption that might happen there. Or if we want to go into a joint venture with Russia to do undersea oil extraction in the Arctic, which I will bet another mortgage payment, he's going to try and get that done before the end of his term. The corruption there would be stunk to high heaven. And sure, Trump would say, yeah, U.S. major who wants to do this, you go do it. And I know there's FCPA and we're not going to enforce against it. You can see the deals where Trump would say, no, we won't touch any FCPA issues because it serves our interest. This has nothing to do with that. This is building a construction site in India somewhere, and they were paying off some of the local government officials. Does make me wonder if they would ever actually have enforcement in India for the bribery payments they paid there. And I know that the Indian legal system, they will probably wind up coming to trial in the year 2350, but I don't know. It's a sad denouement, but no, I do not think these guys are going to see, this trial's never going to see the light of day, given who's running the Justice Department these days.
I want to maybe take it in a little bit different twist, Karen, because I want to take the position of the defendants in this case. I have been one of the loudest to excoriate them for what I perceive to be their alleged violation of the FCPA. But even people who may or may not have violated laws do have the right to go to trial at some point. And to have this hanging over them literally for 6 years is beyond the pale, in my opinion. I was sort of hoping the court would tell the DOJ 6 months, a case dismissed with prejudice. Now, because at some point you have to let these people get on with their life or not, one way or the other. And I think it's the DOJ made misstep after misstep after misstep. And at the time, it might have been a multilateral treaty that got slowed down in India, and it may have seemed all reasonable at the time, but 6 years is still 6 years. And those who excoriate the DOJ for taking so long, this is going to be the poster child going forward, whether or not these guys did something violative. So I think at some point you have to let people get on with their life and go to trial. And if I were the trial court, I wouldn't have hesitated to dismiss this now. And at some points, defendants have procedural rights in this country, or at least they used to. And I think we have all focused on potentially what they did, but they have some rights too. And I just want defendants to have some right to get on with their lives.
That's fair. Like I said, they did agree to having it be taught. So it's a valid point if you can ever maybe completely waive that constitutional right or whatever, but they're willing to. And like I said, I think for good reason, because they know that's in their best interest to just kick it down the road knowing it won't go anywhere. But yeah, I think I take your point.
All right, on to Karen Moore. Karen Moore, is there such a thing as illegal DEI?
Yeah, I think that it's a great question. I'm not sure what part of it is illegal, the diversity, the equity, or the inclusion. It seems to be a kind of crazy catch-all phrase. I'm assuming it means things like illegal discrimination or illegal impact on individuals for actions undertaken by agencies or in the private sector. What was legal before the executive order is still legal. What was illegal based on federal and state equal opportunity laws is still illegal. So I'm not really sure what illegal DEI is, because I don't think we're talking about the law. I think we're talking about public policy, political whim, directed action. I think fear of investigation or shifts in enforcement. We've seen some kind of crazy things happening. I really resent having to even talk about it continuously. And Tom, next time I definitely want to talk about something more exciting, sustainability reporting and the DEI is becoming an exhausting topic, and a lot of it doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I've been taking a look at the impact on federal contracts and federal contractors, as well as what's going on in the public sector, to try and understand what is illegal DEI. I mean, there's been a real shift in the instructions given to federal contractors to say that you can't create any kind of programs that advance women or minorities or anybody in the LGBTQ plus community. Interestingly, not covering veterans and disabled individuals, because those affirmative action plans are actually protected by law. So you kind of have to skirt around those because they're legal. So the whole gender issue, I think, now means that contractors and companies need to take a look and make sure that they've got single-sex bathrooms available. I don't know, that doesn't always make a whole lot of sense to me, depending on what your setup is. Get out of my bathroom. But in any event, these enforcement is supposed to be with contractors under the False Claims Act, which I think is a pretty scary thing, because it's basically saying that contractors have to agree that compliance with these anti-discrimination laws, but really read policy more than laws, is material to payment claims. So if you're found to be violating discrimination laws, then your claims for payment now violate the False Claims Act. So that's, I think, a kind of scary, difficult thing for federal contractors to navigate, to make sure that they really want to get paid without actually ending up with any kind of quitan. cases or any kind of trouble damage results. I think that's a really scary enforcement message. They also have to certify that they don't have DEI programs that violate discrimination laws. So I think it's put federal contractors, not only current contractors, needing to review and potentially face cancellation of current contracts, but also future federal contractors. So I think it's had a lot of companies scrambling to figure out how that's going to work. Now, interestingly, there is a preliminary injunction that's been granted by the U.S. District Court in Maryland, yay, Maryland, and the Trump administration request to stay that temporary injunction was denied yesterday. So that was also good news. So it's preventing terminating or changing existing federal contracts on the basis that they're equity related. The court held that at least there is a chance that they are likely unconstitutional, but they're vague and they have an impact on free speech. So I think that's all now up in the air as to where that's going. Moving into the kind of private sector impact beyond the bathroom issue, we had what I thought was really interesting turnabout of affairs when Trump was claiming witch hunt so much in the past. Really smacks of a witch hunt in that the executive order says that each agency should identify up to 9 target where the DOJ is going to investigate these companies for their DEI programs. And they called out specific industries, major corporations, financial institutions, airlines, law enforcement agencies, which in the last few years have really tried to focus on their diversity issues, and in higher education institutions, which to me starts to smack of a witch hunt, especially when you start seeing who's been the target of these. And I think that all of us in the compliance and legal community have been following what's been going on with Covington and Burling. And then more recently in the last couple of days, Perkins Coie, where Trump issued an order suspending the Perkins Coie security clearances on the basis of DEI activities, that they're dishonest and dangerous. You can't hire, if you're in a public agency, Perkins and Coie without special permission. They called out that Perkins and Coie and also Covington and Burling, the quotas for hiring, excluding applications for fellowships on race basis. And he's ordered the EEOC to review law firm practices. Interestingly, so far, the 2 law firms that have been in the crosshairs are law firms that have represented interests against Trump's own interests. So again, kind of witch hunt. You're really wondering now where these 9 targets are going to be. We've seen, I think really disappointingly, the state AGs kind of piling on. Most recently, we had 19 state AGs signing a letter demanding that Costco, a private company, end unlawful discriminatory practices. Texas AG notified a bunch of financial institutions, including JP Morgan, Citibank, Bank of America, about their enforcement of DEI commitments if they violate consumer rights. So we've got kind of that also taking a look at what's going on there. It's one thing to say we're going to enforce things in a certain way. It's another to start changing or targeting individual industries or individual companies or individual organizations. So I think in the private sector, we've got a whole bunch of uncertainty coming up. What's really interesting to me is that there are equal opportunity laws in place already set out a pretty robust set of terms in terms of discrimination. And we have to remember that the Bostock case afforded Title VII protections based on sexual orientation and gender identity. So it feels like to me, Trump's own executive orders are at risk of challenge on the basis that they violate the equal opportunity for protections. Again, back to bathrooms, I guess. I'm kind of struggling. In some ways, I feel like there are opportunities, and I've talked about this in the past, and others have talked about it much more eloquently than I have, for companies to really examine their practices, just in case their practices, maybe unintentionally in trying to do the right thing, could present discrimination exposure. And there's a really interesting case before the Supreme Court right now, Ames versus Iowa, something which challenges the standards for discrimination against majority groups. So it'll be interesting to see what the Supreme Court has to say about that. I do think that's going to have an impact on corporate professional development programs that were aimed at specific groups, trying to build up skills and network building, creating employee resource groups and mentorships for underrepresented populations within their own organization. So I do think that companies need to be prepared, and I've mentioned this in the past as well, for helpline calls and calls for investigation and challenges internally from the majority. And how are you equipped to sensitively listen and handle those claims and have those conversations, or anticipate even better those issues and have those conversations within your own organization, making sure that you're trying to do really fact-based reviews of your practices by doing pay audits. What are the rates of access to opportunity, promotions, firings, et cetera, based on different classes? That all seems to be okay. Taking a look at your training. I do think that in the past, there have been some kind of over efforts to start saying that there are certain people who are going to be inherently racist no matter what, trying to train on areas like the patriarchy and white fragility. It's just going to backfire. It doesn't matter how well considered they are or how much in the social sciences these things can be proved or disproved. Trying to train on that is going to alienate people, so maybe not that effective. Make sure that your training makes sense. I've talked in the past about the kind of the branding problem that DEI has and trying to reframe it. I've seen some really interesting efforts to rebrand DEI as belonging, the idea that we want everyone to feel that they belong in the organization, which was great. I saw at least one that rebranded to meritocracy initiative, borrowing from Trump's own language, which I think is fantastic because we all want a meritocracy. So trying to examine what's preventing meritocracy from happening is maybe another way of implementing DEI, but kind of deciding what you're going to give up on and what you're going to double down on, I think is an important internal conversation. And just maybe don't be afraid.
Matt, do you have a question or comment for Karen?
I had a couple of thoughts. First, I think for everybody who's worried about this, clearly the root of the problem with the Justice Department and all the other regulators in the Trump administration is who's using the bathrooms. Here is the solution for all the listeners. This is my big vision. No bathrooms in the company. And then you just put a whole bunch of individual porta potties in the parking lot. Problem solved. That is what we're going to wind up all doing by 2029 when this administration ends. I won't bet my mortgage payment on that. I'll just bet a cup of coffee. But folks, it squares with what they want to see. Apparently, that's going to be our solution. But more seriously, I had been giving some thought about how this anti-DEI quest from the Justice Department might tie companies and organizations into knots. And Karen Moore, I don't know if you have any thoughts about this, but I'm really curious, how will the Justice Department and I guess other regulators, but I'll use DOJ as the camel in the tent, how's this going to butt up against corporations' free speech rights? Because my understanding is that corporations are people too, and therefore they do have free speech rights. And I was intrigued when I saw the interim U.S. attorney for the District of Columbia for Washington, D.C. He fired off a letter to Georgetown Law saying that he was very upset and curious about how they were using DEI at Georgetown Law and teaching DEI. So that's not just you have an illegal DEI program, but you are, I guess, illegally teaching that DEI might be a thing. And kudos to the dean of Georgetown Law, who then fired off a reply, which he noted, "Dear interim U.S. Attorney Martin," which is the most polite FU I have ever heard, but well done, pointing out that this is a free speech thing and universities do have free speech. So where are we going to draw that line? I suspect where Trump would want to draw that line, but that's something that I think a lot of organizations will wind up bumping into. Number two, Karen Moore, you had mentioned about how companies might need or contractors might need to certify that they don't have an illegal DEI program. I am kind of curious, will the administration ever actually put out guidance for what an illegal DEI program would be, that you could therefore not do it? I'm going to guess the answer is probably not, because I don't think they know what that would be. I know they just know that it sounds good, or let's say it. And then C, I do think that there's going to be whistleblower versus whistleblower at a lot of large organizations. Maybe people will be complaining internally on your whistleblowing hotline about what is illegal DEI or what is illegal anti-discrimination or discrimination. But maybe I know that they're already setting up government hotlines so that you can report your employer for operating an illegal DEI program. So you might have people reporting your company to the feds. And like this is all the recipe for making a gigantic HR and compliance mess. Because I don't think the administration knows what an actual illegal DEI program is. They just like to use the phrase, or am I wrong?
Well, that's a whole bunch of questions directed at me, but I'll start with the last one. I don't think you're wrong at all. And I do think, as I began, that the key is this term illegal. There's got to be a law that's being violated for it to be illegal. If we see more claims being brought before the EEOC or to the Civil Rights Division that are based on real discriminatory practices, that's great. Maybe people start to identify them. To the extent that they're being used kind of punitively or in a reactionary way, or where agencies are being asked to actually highlight companies that are operating DEI, illegal DEI practices, I'd like to know, where are they getting that information from? On what basis are they determining that they're illegal DEI practices happening in organizations, if not from whistleblowers? But sure, if we're going to have False Claims Act coverage for these things, I can see a whole new income stream happening, Matt, for your mortgage payments, because all you need to do is start reporting federal contractors for their illegal DEI practices, because you can be sure that, at least in the kind of Trump world, they're all engaged in them. They're trying to train their employees. They're trying to make sure that people are being treated fairly. I don't know. It's kind of a crazy situation. I do think on the free speech, that's something that's already become a topic of focus and conversation, and real shout out to all of the different entities and organizations that are challenging these things, bringing them through the court. I'm sorry that they have to waste time and resources. I'm also sorry because these, court processes take such a long time. So we're not going to really maybe see the benefit of it. But I was reading a really interesting case in Florida, of all places, that challenged the ability of a company to train its employees in a mandatory training. They were challenged. This is a company called Honey Fund, I think, and others, where the court held that, no, I'm sorry, free speech allows companies to express their views on diversity and to create mandatory training on DEI beliefs. And Florida is unable and illegally attempting to curtail those free speech rights that are afforded to corporations to express themselves, to create policies, and to create mandatory training on those policies. Now, whether those training, I suppose, result in conduct which could be deemed discriminatory and illegal, that's a different matter. But free speech, I think, is going to be at the center of a lot of these issues. And then the third thing is, I think the individual porta potty is a great solution to the gender problem, at least on the bathroom front. So good one there.
Another benefit for returning to the office. I should probably note that we do not give out financial advice on this podcast. We are not financial advisors. So all of you who may wish to invest in a porta potty business, it's here to stay, but maybe there'll be a bump. With that note, Matt, what do you got for us today?
I was thinking about job cuts within the federal government this week. And in particular, what had caught my eye was the DOGE fever has, I think, finally caught up with the Securities and Exchange Commission, because they had a couple of announcements of fairly large scale job cutbacks that are either going to be happening or are in the midst of happening. So here's what has been happening lately. Is that earlier this week, word came out that the SEC has extended buyout offers, I think, to pretty much all employees, or at least anybody who's been with the agency since the start of 2024, that they would pay you $50,000 to quit. This is one of several orders that have come out. On the other hand, the General Services Administration is also working now to close several of the regional offices of the SEC. They want to close the office in Los Angeles. I've heard that closing the LA office was something they've been thinking about for a while, and it's not specifically driven by DOGE, but DOGE did definitely stepped on the gas of that idea. going to look to close the Philadelphia office, and they would like to close the Chicago office, although they can't figure out how to do that without a big lease termination payment. So as soon as they can get out of the Chicago office, they want to close the Chicago office too. And then number three, they also have told all of the regional directors, I believe there are 10 regional offices at the SEC. Don't hold me to that, but it's in the low double digits. They told all the regional directors their jobs are going to be eliminated. And then on top of that, all of that, at some point soon, the SEC is preparing for even larger job cutbacks for those who did not take the buyout offers, either the fork in the road from Elon back in February or this $50,000 buyout. But I was really struck by how all of this really has nothing to do with government efficiency and nothing to do with the deregulatory burdens, which I thought that's what we were supposed to be doing. But for people who deal with either the SEC or probably many other regulatory agencies, we really need to start thinking about what is this diminished, crippled capacity at regulators that we're going to be stuck with for probably a long time. I think the SEC is a good example of this because, in theory, let's remember, DOGE was all about we were going to find redundant or obsolete regulations and move to eliminate them. Sounds good. I'm all for that. Then we would have these extra staffers, which we could eliminate their jobs or move them on to more productive tasks. Again, I'm fine with that. And then we would be able to consolidate and curtail some government spending and close our $2 trillion annual deficit, which we most definitely need to do. None of what we just outlined as happening at the SEC really addresses any of that. First, the SEC, fun fact, is not funded by taxpayers. It is funded by user fees that the SEC imposes on players in the SEC capital markets, publicly listed companies and financial firms and whatnot. So the Congress might approve the budget, but taxpayers don't actually pay the budget. So none of what we might do at the SEC is going to close the federal deficit by one dime. Second, for all of these buyouts that we're doing and getting rid of staffers, where's the getting rid of the regulation part? Because I thought that was supposed to come first, and we'd assess what do we want the SEC to do, what do we not want it to do. And there are probably numerous rules at the SEC that no longer make any sense, and we could get rid of them. But that's not what acting chairman Ueda is doing, and I presume it's probably not going to be what incoming SEC chairman Paul Atkins, once he gets confirmed, I don't know if that's what he's going to do either. So far, the only thing they've done is they've given a big bear hug and a wet kiss to the crypto industry, but everything else, all those rules and regulations are pretty much still there. Some of them have been delayed for compliance deadlines, but not that many. And still, the vast majority of SEC rules that were in place 3 or 4 weeks ago, they're still here now, and they still will be in 3 or 4 months. But we're cutting staffers while we don't know what rules we may or may not get rid of. So what we're going to wind up with is simply an agency that is less able to do its job. Now, if you are a scofflaw looking to get away with something, this is going to be your big chance because the SEC will have less capacity to chase you down. If you are a good company trying to do the right thing and comply with the law, that's just going to be harder to do. Either you're going to take your best shot and you're never really going to know, okay, they gave us a comment letter 6 months ago, but they haven't gotten back to us yet. Or you're waiting for approval on some sort of shelf registration statement or a new securities offering, but you're going to just wind up waiting for pretty much anything because there's not going to be as many people there. This is you deciding you want to lose some weight, but instead of changing your diet and exercising more, you hack off one of your arms. That is not a good way to lose weight. And this is true for the SEC and for all of the listeners here who deal with the SEC on a regular basis, because I know there's a lot of them. But it's true for a whole lot of other companies or regulators as well. It's true with the FAA. It's going to be true with Health and Human Services. You can see it kind of, sort of, in the way that a lot of these agencies fired first, realize they can't do their jobs, and are now trying to hire people back, whether that's the Nuclear Weapons Security Agency or Social Security is going to be another one. We could go on all day long. And it really just is troubling to me that our go-to move is to weaken these agencies' capacity to do anything before we figure out what should this agency not do. And then let's not do it. And then either reallocate the resources the right way or get rid of them and have less spending, which I am also in favor of once we have some intelligence. This wound up, I guess, being just like a 6-minute rant preemptively. But I do think this is going to be a really difficult challenge for a lot of regulatory compliance professionals, and it's not a good idea.
Who wants to go first with a question or comment?
I'll go just in comment language, which is, it just feels like another example where Donald Trump has made some statements and some moves in a direction that speaks to kind of popular fears and concerns, but ultimately either has no momentum or no legal basis, or in the DOGE case has been really distorted and distracted. Is there inefficiency in government agencies? Absolutely, just the same way there is in any organization. And should that be reviewed, and is there more operational efficiency that can be found? Fantastic. So it sounds good on the surface, just like ending illegal discriminatory practices sounds good on the surface, and it all just it is where it's going. So Matt, I know in the past you've opined that the first Trump administration was all talk and no action. Here it feels so much like all talk and misaction or misdirection. Are we going to start seeing more and more worry shifts in things that sound good on the surface but actually have a different purpose underneath, or in the realization?
I absolutely think so. I think it's going to be all talk, all action that may or may not be related to the talk, such as the back and forth we've seen with the tariffs all week long. But the one thing that seemed to be missing in any of this is any brains to it. Really, there's no thoughtful analysis of what should we be doing at the SEC to protect investors or not protect them? What should we be doing for better access to capital? And there's a lot we could do for that. What's better oversight of capital markets? And let's figure out what we will do and what we won't do, and then match our staff to fulfill that mission. This is just, hey, who wants 50 grand to go out the door? And if there are any listeners from the SEC who are thinking about taking that, guys, get that check in hand before you agree to walk out the door. I would not trust this administration one bit to make good on its promise to pay you. But this is just like I've said several times before over the last couple of weeks. This is no way to run a railroad. And unfortunately, corporate compliance officers, white collar defense lawyers, and corporate securities lawyers, you are passengers on that railroad. And the trains are wobbly and going in the wrong direction, and they're derailing and they're late. And this is going to be a mess. And so far, I haven't seen anything in this administration to suggest they're aware of the problem. They're aware that Elon isn't popular, and now they're saying that the agencies will be in charge of cutting staff instead of Elon. I don't think that's true. But at the end of the day, you can cut however many staff you want once you've decided what are we going to do, and now let's have the manpower for it. This is let's cut the manpower, and oh crap, now we don't know how to do the things that we say we're supposed to do. It's backwards.
Matt, I never thought I would say this about you, but my friend, you are sadly naive. Sadly naive.
Hit me.
Yes, this is exactly what Project 2025 planned. They may have an idiot executing it, but this is exactly what they planned. And the plan is going to be eviscerate all agencies and all enforcement. And it's the government doesn't work. See, here's our proof. And they're going to use that to get rid of even more. So I think this is exactly what they planned. And now that they've found so far they can do all of this, maybe the Supreme Court will overturn it or maybe not. They're just going to continue the sledgehammer, and then they're going to cut 40% of the IRS and then claim we can't collect taxes. No kidding. FAA, I shudder to think what our air traffic safety is going to be like. Probably shut down the NTSB. I don't know where we're going to get quality weather, and I guess we'll have to all pay for it now. But yeah, I think this is exactly what they planned, and this is exactly a part of the plan. And I don't think that, or rather, I don't think Donald Trump is playing chess, but Project 2025 is playing chess.
That may well be, but I would just remind everybody that, yeah, Tom, I do think you're right. But what sort of world will that be for corporations where it's difficult enough to navigate through modern risks? And this is just going to make all of that 20 times worse. And there is no scenario where such a highly chaotic, incompetent, risk-addled organization, government, and economy is going to lead to more economic productivity for your firm. That will not happen. If it were going to happen, the richest country in the world with the best companies in the world would be Russia. And that's not the case. And that's the direction we're going.
Yeah, I agree. We've had a very fulsome, if somewhat dark tinged discussion today, but we're on to shout outs and rants. And Dean Treanor was going to be a favorite of several of us, but we're going to cede that one to Ms. Woody because the letter he wrote was just so outstanding. So we'll go in the same order. Karen Woody, Karen Moore, Matt Kelly, and I'll back cleanup today on the shout outs and rants. Karen Woody, what do you got?
As you said, I was going to echo Matt and his shout out to Dean Treanor. And I can say this as a love of Georgetown law, but also just as an academic, as someone who's in an institution of higher education and seeing these letters fly around and see the anxiety on the faces of a number of people in charge that we've gotten to this place. But you're exactly right. Dean Treanor spared. Yeah, I think you're right that it was very politely just scathing and down to the, you're right, interim, the use of interim in relation to the position that Ed Martin holds more than once in this. But I think the import of it is clear and also beyond just critical for everyone to recognize. Georgetown University is a private university that is, and as Treanor points out, a Jesuit institution that is founded upon the principles of diversity in the sense that it always has appreciated and tangled with ideas that are different and to people of different faiths and culture. And he mentions that this is a moral and educational imperative to have that discourse. And what I think actually is worth mentioning, I don't know if we've said this as clearly yet in this podcast, but that the reason he's writing this letter is because Ed Martin said he would not hire anyone from Georgetown Law if this curriculum existed and that they had been trained in such a wildly left-wing institution such as Georgetown Law. So if there's any actual discrimination here taking place, is it this refusal to hire any Georgetown Law grad to the DC U.S. Attorney's Office is already completely bananas. That already is sort of beyond across the bow. And so I think the letter responds in kind in that sense. And he also mentions this isn't, not that it matters, but it's also Georgetown Law. This isn't some community college down the road. This is Georgetown. And he points out we are the preeminent legal institutions in this country. And so that you would actually swing at us as maybe seeming as violating some constitutional right. And he's, I think, if anything, is saying you, sir, are violating a constitutional right here in this case. So shout out. I'm saddened that this is something we have to hold up as sort of this paragon of bravery or something this week, when this should be, I think, a settled principle that this is not something anyone should stand for. And shout out to Dean Treanor for carrying the water on this one. But like I said, I hope this doesn't seem like he is at all an outlier, because he shouldn't be.
Karen Moore, you've got a high bar.
I do, but that's such a positive statement and right in my backyard. But what is also happening in my backyard are so many federal employees, and I know it's across the nation, but I am in the Washington, D.C. metro region, and I cannot even count now the number of conversations I've had with people trying to make introductions, trying to provide advice. But I suppose sometimes the only thing I can really do is provide an ear, some sympathy, a big hug. And they're just some really amazing people who have dedicated themselves to public service, who are now finding themselves just not just mistreated, but trying to pivot into a different direction in their lives. And I know Hema Lomax is on the call, and I just want to give a shout out to Hema because she has really made an effort not just to put herself out there, but to provide resources to people. Really, I am thinking about all these amazing people. I really hope that people land where they need to land, that their dedication to public service not only doesn't go unappreciated, but also comes back to play in their lives in a better way. And anything that I can do, short maybe of contributing my mortgage payments, I just leave myself out there as a resource.
Kelly.
Since I have already ranted enough on this podcast, I'm going to switch gears to trying to give a shout out to just one of the many people in this world who slowly, steadily, consistently did a good thing. And I just wanted to note the passing of a Australian man by the name of Vane Harrison, who died earlier this week at the age of 88. But his big claim to fame was that when he started giving blood in 1954, while he was a teenager, I think, they discovered that Mr. Harrison, for reasons unknown, had a genetic profile that his blood churned out a large volume of very important antibodies called anti-D. I don't really know exactly what anti-D does, except it helps pregnant women who might have the baby having a conflicted RH factor in mother versus child. And that can be a big problematic thing. And I had a sibling where that was a big problematic issue with my mother when she was carrying my sibling to term back in long ago. But his blood was able to address that difficulty. And so therefore his blood was quite valuable. So for the next 64 years, while he could donate blood as often as he could, he did, and he donated blood 1,173 times over the course of his life until finally in 2018, the Australian authorities said, "We love you, but you are now too old. You should not give any more blood." And he would have if he could have. But he probably made a he affected millions of lives over the course of his 64 years of donating blood. It's just a great story of how people can improve other people's lives just for the sake of doing the right thing. And he did it week after week, month after month, year after year. And we should all take note of people like him who are doing the right thing quietly, consistently. They're the ones who make this world a better place. And so did he. And thank you, Mr. Harrison. And good luck wherever you may be now.
I'm going to go international for my shout out, although not very far. I'm going to go north of the border. And I'm going to give a shout out to the Quebecois. And a little history lesson is in order. In Quebec, English-speaking descendants of English settlers controlled the province with an iron fist until the mid-50s. And there was actually a fight at a Montreal Canadian hockey game. Was the first time the French-speaking Canadians of Quebecois, who are in the majority, began to coalesce around a feeling that they were different. And that feeling went along for 20 years until René Lévesque, who is the prime minister of Quebec, or became the prime minister, threatened to take Quebec out of Canada. And since that time, there's been a very varying tensions between the French-speaking Canadians in Quebec and the English-speaking Canadians in Quebec and the rest of the country. One Donald J. Trump has managed to change all of that. And as the example I would give you, I do a podcast with two English-speaking Quebecers on science fiction. And they both told me for the first time ever, they heard French-speaking Canadians at a Montreal Canadian hockey game sing the Canadian national anthem in English. And they said they never thought they would hear that in their lifetime. And the Quebecois are saying, we may be Quebecois, but we're Canadians. And elbows up. So elbows up to the Quebecois. All right.